My Adventures with Superman is one of those shows that acts as a battleground in the culture war. So much so that the very first promotional image sparked massive outrage and debate online, all centering around the race swaps of previously established characters, a subject that I am not going to touch with a 10-foot pole, at least not in this video. The debates sparked again when the first few episodes of the show came out. People on both sides of the ideological battle posted out-of-context clips as evidence of their previously held beliefs. However, in the midst of these petty squabbles and shit-hurling contests, there lies a question that no one has considered. Is this show any good? Well, that's what we're here to suss out today. We're gonna look at the execution of several aspects of this show to answer this often forgotten question: whether My Adventures with Superman is superb Superman content or just super mid. The most important aspect of any Superman adaptation is capturing what has made Superman such an iconic character for almost 90 years. And this element of Superman that has persisted throughout the years, that endears audiences to him, is not his immense power. It's that he uses his immense power exclusively to help other people. The depth of his kindness and selflessness allows him to act as an aspirational figure and cements Superman as a key figure of the American mythos. And it is so refreshing that Superman's kindness is front and center in this show. It's a breath of fresh air, especially considering the DCEU's, let's say, less than ideal interpretation of the character.
Krypton had its chance!
This Clark is heroic, a trait we, unfortunately, don't get to see in our heroes nearly as much as we should. He's the first to jump straight into danger, even when, no, especially when, he himself is not safe.
How did you know you'd be bulletproof?
I didn't. I just knew that you weren't.
Another thing I like is that Clark's nerdy and awkward personality also shines through in this show, showcasing the man in Superman. However, despite all of the praise I'm giving, I do have one criticism of Clark's characterization. Clark doesn't have control over his powers. Now, I'd forgive you if the clips I'm showing led you to the impression that Clark unlocked his powers relatively recently. However, this is not the case. He first unlocked his powers at around 10 years old, and Clark is about 22 when the show begins. Now, why is this relevant? It's relevant because a character's actions and inactions tell us more about a character than their dialogue. It's not enough for Supes to say he cares about people. He has to show us that he does. So a character that really cares about protecting others and his identity would seemingly do everything in his power to make sure that his superpowers are under control. Many interpretations of Superman have an immense fear of their powers getting out of their control and hurting the ones they care about the most. So it's safe to assume that similar fears fester in this version of Clark. On top of that, he has had at least 10 years to ensure his powers are in his control, and every reason to ensure that task is complete. I mean, he lived on an empty farm for the vast majority of his life, with seemingly nothing else to do. Now, I have heard the counterargument that his nervousness about his new job is the reason his powers were on the fritz. However, the people who make this claim haven't seen the show. Or, at least they haven't watched up to episode 5. Because in episode 5, Jimmy Olsen reveals that Clark has been destroying common household items ever since they first met. So Clark's lack of control of his powers is a consistent issue for him that dates back at least several years. Besides that one major writing hiccup, the interpretation of Clark in this show is mostly superb. So, how do the other characters stack up? Unfortunately, I can't give the level of praise to the supporting cast as I can to Clark. The best I can say about any of these characters is that they are perfectly serviceable. And most of those characters are typically like minor roles. The characters that most emphasize the shortcomings in character writing are the antagonists. Deathstroke, Livewire, Intergang, Parasite all fall flat, especially in comparison to other interpretations of the characters. And I just want it to be perfectly clear. It is okay to have drastically different interpretations of comic book characters. Some of my favorite interpretations of characters are vastly different from their source material. However, when comparing interpretations, it's obvious which characters are more interesting. Let's take Livewire, for example. In Superman the Animated Series, Livewire was a radio shock jock, antagonizing Superman for more viewership and tarnishing his name to prop up her own. Versus the My Adventures version, which is just a bland mercenary with very few discernible character traits and a really, really unfortunate haircut. Am I supposed to believe that the writers saw no way to modernize this character at all? Especially when they modernized Parasite, who is now just an evil Tony Stark. But speaking of modernized characters, that brings us to Deathstroke, who is another villain that is subpar. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's mostly just his voice and his design.
You really think you're the smartest person here, don't you?
I just can't take him seriously. Because every time I hear this man talk, it sounds like he wants to sell me insurance or get ruthlessly bullied by his own children. And he does not look like a military man or a grizzled badass. He looks like a TikTok e-boy. He shouldn't even know what TikTok is. Actually, given his taste in women, he definitely knows what TikTok is. But you might say, sure, these villains, they're not fantastic, but maybe the main characters make up for it.
No.
Jimmy Olsen in this show is really, really annoying. He's the comedic relief character of the show, and he is neither comedic nor relief. He is the epitome of another failing of this show, and that being its comedy. Most of the show's comedy is just random bullshit. Like the writer's credentials come from Tumblr University. Jimmy might be annoying, but at least he's not a bad person. When Clark reveals his secret to Jimmy, he reveals that he knew for some time, but was waiting for Clark to come forward and feel comfortable enough to tell Jimmy himself. Which leads us to this show's interpretation of Lois Lane. But before I address the infamous scene about Lois, I want to get off my chest some aspects I actually enjoy about Lois Lane. I really like that Lois and Clark have a genuine chemistry in this show. They're both driven, motivated people that want to report on the real issues of Metropolis. But they butt heads as their methods are vastly different from each other. But over the course of the show, as they spend more time with each other, they learn to appreciate each other's methods more. Speaking of appreciation, I also appreciate how this show tries to make Lois a more three-dimensional character, as the show hints at her shaky relationship with her father, and her abrasive personality both helping and hurting her depending on the situation, all while showcasing her insecurities about her place in life. Now that I got all the praises out of the way, it's time to address the elephant in the room. When Lois figures out Clark is Superman, and shits on him for daring to keep that fact a secret from her. The major problem being that Lois meets Clark in episode 1 of this show, and finds out he's Superman on episode 5. So at most, Clark keeps this secret from Lois for about a month. Maybe I'll grant you 2 if I'm feeling generous. This means that Lois is mad that Clark did not immediately reveal his deepest, darkest secret to a woman that he just met. Editing boomer here. One thing I forgot to mention is that Lois is really mad at Clark for lying to her about being Superman. However, when they first met, one of the first things she does is lie to Clark and Jimmy about getting Perry's approval on an assignment, risking all of their jobs for her own selfish desires. So not only is she wrong, she's also a hypocrite. The way this scene plays out, it makes Lois seem really entitled. Not helping is her reaction to Jimmy Olsen telling Clark that he knew he was Superman.
You've known this whole time? Why didn't you tell me?
That's right. She makes it all about herself. The show does try to rationalize Lois's reaction by implying her father was a man of many secrets, and she didn't want to see the negative traits of her father in her potential lover. However, if the show wanted the audience to sympathize with Lois, we would need more time with Lois and Clark together, and the consequences of Clark's double life. Imagine, the show saves this moment for like season 2, or maybe even 3, giving us more and more examples of Clark's lies straining on their relationship, making Lois worry about Clark, and Clark blowing off Lois for no real justification. But how things actually are, it makes Lois seem like an entitled bitch that is genuinely angry that Clark didn't tell her every single detail about his life the instant they met. But the poor pacing of this show causes a lot more issues than just this one example. This show rushes through all of the setup of the Superman mythos just to get their desired outcome. Jimmy and Lois, knowing that Clark is Superman, and actively working with him as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter how they get there. A great example of this rushed pacing is episode 7, Kiss Kiss Fallen Portal. The first 6 episodes of this series has Clark dealing with mostly low-level threats, like petty thugs that were gifted tech, or military goons, or just a big old robot. But in this episode, the writers jump from small city-level threats to a fifth-dimensional being in Mr. Mxyzptlk, and a high council of Lois Lanes created to defeat evil Supermen. Personally, Lois might not have been my first choice. Multiversal councils are already starting to get overused in modern media, but at least the other councils make some sort of sense and aren't just a collection of journalists being constructed to fight superhumans and fifth-dimensional beings. Much like the maligned liar revealed scene, the council would have worked a lot better if the writers had an ounce of restraint. But enough about the pacing and the writing of this show. This is an animated show after. Has the animation and art style hold up? My Adventures with Superman is animated by Studio Mir, the South Korean studio behind Legend of Korra.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
And while the art style of the show is aesthetically pleasing, clearly taking a lot of inspiration from anime, the animation can be choppy at times, and I have seen some examples of animation errors. Specifically, when Livewire breaks out of prison, she destroys her collar, but for the entire rest of the episode, she's still wearing the collar. And despite the fact the show is an action cartoon, I, ironically, have the least to say about the action in this show. Now, I could go on and on about tiny details that I either appreciate or am annoyed by in this show, but I'm going to follow my own advice to the writers and exercise restraint. Overall, My Adventures with Superman is a show, while having several strong elements, falls short of even being average, especially in comparison to other, much better Superman adaptations. In fact, if this show wasn't the center of a niche section of the internet culture war, I doubt anyone would even be talking about this show. It's not good enough for wide-scale praise, and nowhere near bad enough to enjoy mocking. It's caught in this awkward middle. It'll neither be remembered for its fame nor its infamy. I recommend that if you're in a fix for some Superman content, then try out any of these before you give this show a shot, as they're all much better encapsulations of what makes Superman great. And let this empty show to its fate.